The Pacific stretched endless and black under a moonless sky, its surface rippling with secrets that would never reach land. At 3:47 hours, communication ceased from SEAL Team 7. No distress call, no beacon, just silence where there had been chatter, coordination, breathing. The USS Gerald R. Ford held position 60 nautical miles from the last known coordinates, its deck crew scanning horizons that refused to answer. In the Combat Information Center, Admiral Keller stood with arms crossed, jaw working slowly on nothing but tension. 26 souls had dropped into those waters on what should have been a textbook reconnaissance insertion. Now the ocean held them like a closed fist, and no one knew if it would ever open. The helicopter that had delivered them reported normal deployment, rotors cutting through salt spray, infrared signatures dropping clean into the dark. Then nothing. Search and rescue birds launched within the hour, sweeping predetermined grids with thermal imaging that revealed only the indifferent cold of deep water. The silence wasn't just absence of sound. It was wrong, the kind of wrong that crawled up spines and made seasoned operators check their gear twice. Something had swallowed an entire team, and the Navy wanted answers before dawn broke and questions started flowing from Washington. That's when they called her. Lieutenant Commander Vesper Kane hadn't flown combat search and rescue in 3 years, not since the incident over the Strait of Hormuz that left her grounded and reassigned to training rotations. Her call sign, Ghostwater, carried weight in certain circles, whispered with equal parts respect and caution. She'd pulled 11 souls from the Mediterranean when their Osprey went down in conditions that should have been impossible, threading her MH-60 Seahawk through electrical storms that turned instruments into liars and prayer into navigation. But she'd also disobeyed direct orders to do it, extending her fuel beyond safety margins, pushing her aircraft past tolerances that existed for reasons written in blood. The Navy thanked her with a medal and a desk. Now they needed her again, and the summons came without ceremony. A petty officer found her in the ready room, still in flight suit from a training evolution, studying approach patterns that would never see real use. "Ma'am, Admiral wants you in CIC. Immediately." The walk through passageways felt longer than it should have, boots on steel decking counting out rhythm against the hum of a carrier that never truly slept. Keller didn't waste time with pleasantries when she entered. His face carried the particular exhaustion of command during crisis, lines deepened by decisions that wouldn't wait for comfort. "Kane, SEAL Team 7 went dark 4 hours ago. Standard insertion, deep reconnaissance, nothing exotic. Radio discipline until phase line Charlie, then complete communications failure. We've had birds up since 400. Nothing but empty ocean and equipment that swears it's working fine." He pulled up a tactical display, coordinates glowing amber against simulated bathymetry. "Weather's clean. No hostile activity detected. No debris field, it's like they vanished." Vesper studied the screen, her mind already working through scenarios, calculating fuel loads and search patterns, running probabilities that refused to add up to anything good. "Current drift calculations," she asked, voice level, professional. A younger officer, Lieutenant Bosch, pulled up modeling data. "We've factored wind, current, thermoclines. High probability zones are expanding by the hour. If they're in the water, they're spreading. If they're not." He didn't finish. Didn't need to. Vesper's eyes traced the expanding circles, each one representing diminishing hope, time bleeding out into an ocean that kept perfect secrets. "I need a bird prepped. Full SAR loadout, extended fuel tanks, and a crew that won't blink when things get strange." Keller exchanged glances with his operations officer, a silent conversation Vesper had seen before, doubt wrapped in necessity. "Commander, I'm authorizing this because you're the best we have for impossible situations, but I need you to understand the parameters. You don't break protocol. You don't exceed operational limits. You find them or you don't, but you bring my aircraft back intact." The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning. This was rehabilitation, a chance to prove she could be trusted again, that her instincts wouldn't override her judgment. Vesper met his eyes without flinching. "Understood, sir." The flight deck thrummed with controlled chaos. aircraft handlers in colored jerseys directing movement in a ballet of barely contained violence. Her Seahawk sat ready, rotor blades still folded, weapons pylons empty but fuel tanks swollen with extra capacity. The crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Ortiz, supervised final checks with the methodical precision of someone who'd seen what happened when corners got cut. Vesper's co-pilot, Lieutenant Nash Garrett, was already in the cockpit running pre-flight, his hands moving through switches and gauges with practiced efficiency. They'd flown together before, back when her career trajectory pointed up instead of sideways. He'd never asked about Hormuz, never treated her like damaged goods or a liability wearing silver oak leaves. That counted for something. "Bird's tight," Ortiz reported, handing her the checklist tablet. "Extra fuel means we're heavy, but she'll fly. Weather's holding clear, but there's a low-pressure system building northeast. Could get interesting if you're out long." Vesper nodded, scanning the data, committing numbers to memory that would matter when decisions needed making at 100 knots with salt spray blinding the windscreen. Radio package. Encrypted tactical, emergency guard frequencies, and we've loaded the SEAL team's specific encryption keys. If they're transmitting anything, even weak, you'll hear it. She climbed aboard, settling into the left seat, hands finding controls that felt like extensions of her own nervous system. The helicopter smelled like hydraulic fluid, metal, and purpose. Nash glanced over, his face illuminated by instrument glow. "Feels like old times," he said quietly. "Let's hope it ends better," Vesper replied, reaching for the overhead switches. The turbines began their whine, building toward the roar that would carry them into darkness and questions that might not have answers. The deck crew stepped back as rotor blades unfolded, then began their rotation, slowly at first, then faster, until the Seahawk trembled with barely restrained power. Launch clearance came through crisp and immediate. Vesper brought the collective up smoothly, feeling the weight shift as the Seahawk lifted from the deck, transitional lift converting power into altitude. The carrier fell away below, a city of lights against black water. Then they were out over the Pacific with nothing but darkness in all directions. Navigation displays painted synthetic reality where human eyes saw only void. The coordinates for SEAL Team 7's last known position glowed steady on the multifunction display, still 63 nautical miles distant. Vesper settled into cruise configuration, adjusting pitch and power for maximum endurance, every decision now a calculation between speed and fuel, urgency and sustainability. Ghostwater 11, Carrier Tactical, you're cleared to search Grid Alpha, reference point 01. SAR coordination frequency active, combat rescue channel monitoring, the radio crackled. Ghostwater copies all, Nash responded, his voice carrying the particular cadence of military radio communication, compressed and efficient. The helicopter carved through the night at 140 knots, turbine harmonics a steady backdrop to concentration. Vesper scanned instruments in practice sweeps, cross-checking automation against intuition, looking for the subtle wrongness that preceded disaster. The ocean below remained featureless, its surface texture invisible in the darkness. On thermal imaging, it showed as uniform cool blue-gray, no heat signatures, no variation, nothing that suggested human presence. They reached the search grid's initial reference point exactly on schedule. Vesper began the methodical pattern, parallel tracks separated by optimal visual and sensor coverage, each pass covering water that might hold survivors or might hold nothing but eternal patience. "How long can SEALs survive in water this temperature?" Nash asked, though he already knew the answer. "Depends on conditioning, body mass, cold water immersion gear. 6 to 10 hours before hypothermia becomes critical, longer if they clustered for warmth or found flotation debris." The unspoken calculation hung between them. They were already past 4 hours since communication ceased. 30 minutes into the grid pattern, the radio hissed with something that wasn't quite static. Vesper's hand went to the volume instinctively, turning it up, listening past the white noise for structure, for meaning. There, again, not voice but rhythmic, something regular buried in interference. "You hearing this?" she asked. Nash nodded, already adjusting frequency filters, trying to isolate the signal. "It's weak," Degraded could be equipment malfunction or he didn't finish. Could be someone trying to transmit with damaged gear, with failing batteries, with hypothermic fingers that couldn't quite key the microphone properly. Vesper altered course 15 degrees, following bearing estimates, trying to triangulate something that might be imagination or might be life fighting to persist. The ocean offered no visual confirmation, just the same endless black. They'd covered another 8 square nautical miles when Ortiz, manning the sensor station in back, called out with sudden urgency. Contact thermal anomaly bearing 270, range approximately 4,000 yards. Discrete source possible human-sized signature. Vesper banked hard, bringing the Seahawk around, losing altitude to close distance. The FLIR display resolved slowly, pixel by pixel, building an image of something warmer than surrounding water. Not much warmer, but enough. As they closed to 2,000 yards, details emerged. Not one signature, multiple, clustered together. Moving slightly, not drifting but treading water. Ghostwater 11 Carrier Tactical, we have multiple thermal contacts at grid reference Echo 73, probable survivors, moving to investigate. Vesper brought the helicopter into hover at 300 feet, close enough for spotlight illumination, far enough to avoid rotor wash dispersing whatever they'd found. Nash activated the multi-million candle power searchlight, and suddenly the ocean below exploded into visibility. 6 figures. No, 7. Floating in a tight group, orange exposure suits glowing in the artificial light like flowers blooming in darkness. But something was immediately wrong. The swimmers weren't waving, weren't signaling, weren't exhibiting the desperate energy of people seeing rescue arrive. They floated with eerie stillness, maintaining position but not acknowledging the helicopter thundering above. Vesper keyed the external loudspeaker. SEAL Team 7, this is Navy SAR, we have you in sight. Acknowledge if able. The figures below didn't respond. One appeared to be supported by others, head lolling against a teammate's shoulder. The group's positioning was deliberate, protective, surrounding something at the center. Get the rescue swimmer ready, Vesper ordered. Something's not right down there. Ortiz moved with practiced speed, helping their swimmer, Petty Officer Reyes, into harness and checking connections that would matter when human weight hung above an ocean that killed through simple patience. Vesper maintained hover, fighting mild wind shear that tried to push them off station, making constant micro-adjustments to keep the Seahawk stable. Below, one of the figures finally moved, raising an arm in slow acknowledgement, the gesture carrying exhaustion that transcended normal fatigue. Deploying swimmer, Ortiz announced. Reyes went out the side door and down the hoist cable, descending through rotor wash and spray until he splashed into the Pacific. He swam toward the group with strong, efficient strokes, closing distance while Vesper held position overhead. The radio crackled, not from the carrier but from Reyes' waterproof communicator. Jesus Christ, his voice came through, stripped of professional composure. We need medical immediately, we need. They're carrying someone, Static broke the transmission. Vesper's hands tightened on controls. Reyes, say again, who are they carrying? When his voice returned, it carried something worse than fear, horror, understanding. It's their commander, Lieutenant Davenport. Ma'am, he's dead. They've been keeping him afloat for hours. They won't let him go. The night suddenly felt colder, despite pressurized warmth inside the cockpit. Below, Reyes reached the group, and Vesper watched through the spotlight as the SEALs finally broke formation. Their movements were mechanical, exhausted beyond human limits, operating on training and will when body and mind should have surrendered hours ago. The figure at the center remained motionless, supported by hands that refused to release even when survival required it. Begin recovery, Vesper ordered, voice steady through force of will. Priority to living personnel, but bring everyone. The next 30 minutes became a test of precision flying, holding hover position while Ortiz worked the hoist, bringing up survivors one by one. Each SEAL that came aboard collapsed onto the deck, too cold and exhausted for words, just breathing, existing, grateful for metal and noise and the promise of warmth. Reyes attached the final harness to Lieutenant Davenport's body with visible reluctance, and the hoist brought him up slowly, respectfully, as if speed might dishonor sacrifice. When the last SEAL cleared the water, Vesper transitioning to forward flight, pointing the Seahawk back toward the carrier with a cargo of 7 exhausted operators and one who would never be exhausted again. Ghostwater 1-1 to carrier tactical. We have 8 souls aboard, 7 survivors, 1 KIA. Survivors are hypothermic but stable. Request immediate deck clear and medical standby. The response came immediate. Roger, Ghostwater, cleared direct approach, deck clear, medical standing by. Good work out there. But it didn't feel like good work. It felt like they'd interrupted something profound, something the ocean hadn't finished teaching. Ortiz moved among the survivors, wrapping them in emergency blankets, checking pulses, offering water in small sips. They were coming back to themselves slowly, shivering uncontrollable tremors that signaled bodies remembering how to fight cold. One of them, a senior chief with a face that looked carved from stone beneath hypothermic pallor, caught Vesper's eye through the cockpit door. He said nothing, but his expression carried weight. Gratitude mixed with grief, relief mixed with guilt at being alive when their commander wasn't. The carrier materialized out of darkness ahead, lights precise and ordered, a floating city of military purpose. Vesper brought the Seahawk in with textbook precision, feeling the deck rise to meet them, landing gear compressing with familiar solid impact. Medical personnel swarmed the moment rotors spooled down, moving with controlled urgency, triaging the living while treating the dead with careful dignity. Lieutenant Davenport's body was removed first, placed on a stretcher with flag-draped solemnity that felt both appropriate and insufficient. The SEALs watched him go, still silent, still processing survival earned at costs they were only beginning to calculate. Admiral Keller met Vesper on the flight deck, his face unreadable in the industrial lighting. "Debriefing in 1 hour, CIC. Get some coffee, get your head straight." She nodded, exhaustion pressing down with physical weight. Nash secured the aircraft, running post-flight checks, while Ortiz cleaned blood-tinged seawater from deck surfaces that had held too much human cost. Vesper walked toward the island's superstructure, boots echoing on non-skid coating, surrounded by activity that continued regardless of individual drama. The carrier didn't stop, didn't pause, because missions continued and the ocean didn't care about human grief. In the ready room, she poured coffee that tasted like burned exhaustion and stared at wall-mounted displays showing training schedules, maintenance rotations, the endless administrative machinery of military aviation. Someone had already updated the status board, moving SEAL Team 7 from missing to recovered. One line marked KIA in red letters that felt too small for the reality they represented. The debriefing came exactly 1 hour later, as promised. The CIC felt crowded with officers who hadn't been there during the initial briefing, intelligence personnel, medical staff, and several civilians in suits that marked them as agency rather than military. Admiral Keller presided with the same exhausted authority, but now something else lurked beneath. Questions that needed answers before paperwork could begin its inevitable journey through channels. "Commander Kane, walk us through the recovery." Vesper stood, aware of eyes measuring her differently now, the suspicion and doubt replaced by something else, not quite trust but approaching respect. She detailed the flight methodically, the signal they detected, the thermal contacts, the condition of survivors and the deceased. When she finished, one of the civilians leaned forward, his face carrying the particular intensity of someone whose job involved secrets. The SEALs report they lost their commander approximately 2 hours after insertion. Equipment malfunctioned during dive operations at depth that should have been safe. By the time they surfaced with him, he was gone. They maintained group cohesion, activated emergency beacon, and waited for rescue while performing continuous CPR despite knowing it was futile. The room absorbed this information in silence. Someone had died doing something that should have been routine, killed by failure in a system supposed to be triple redundant, leaving teammates to carry impossible choices through dark water for hours. "Why didn't they let him go?" someone asked, the question naive but necessary. The senior SEAL chief, now wrapped in blankets but insisting on attending, answered with voice roughened by cold and something deeper. "Because we don't leave anyone behind. Not alive, not dead, not ever. That's the promise." That's what we are. No one argued. No one could. The principle transcended logic or efficiency, existed in spaces where brotherhood meant more than survival instinct. Keller shifted focus, his eyes finding Vesper with intent that suggested this had always been the real purpose of the gathering. Commander Kane, I'm going to ask you directly. During your search, did you exceed operational parameters? Did you push limits we discussed? The room went quiet, waiting. This was the test, the moment where redemption balanced against the instinct that made her both exceptional and dangerous. Vesper met his gaze without deflection. No, sir. We maintained fuel reserves, followed search protocols, and stayed within mission parameters throughout. When we located survivors, we executed standard rescue procedures. It was truth, and everyone present knew it. She'd done it by the book, proved she could operate within constraints, demonstrated that the Hormuz incident had been outlier rather than pattern. Keller nodded slowly, something like satisfaction crossing his face. Good. Because I'm reinstating you to full operational status effective immediately. We need pilots who can find people when they're hiding in the ocean, and apparently you have a talent for that. The words landed with unexpected weight. Reinstatement meant more than flying, meant trust restored, meant the slow crawl back from career purgatory could accelerate toward purpose. Vesper felt something unknot in her chest that had been tight for 3 years. Thank you, sir. The debriefing continued for another 40 minutes, details and reports, and the endless documentation that followed military operations. Eventually, they were dismissed, released back into the carrier's 24-hour rhythm, and Vesper found herself back on the flight deck under stars that hadn't existed during the mission's darkness. The Seahawk sat secured and silent, maintenance crew performing post-flight inspections, finding nothing wrong because sometimes aircraft performed flawlessly and people still died. Nash appeared beside her, his presence comfortable and undemanding. "You did good tonight," he said simply. "We got lucky," Vesper replied. "If that signal hadn't come through, if the thermal imaging hadn't caught them, they'd still be out there. But it did come through and you heard it. You followed it when it could have been nothing and you brought them home. That's not luck, that's skill." She wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that competence and instinct deserved credit rather than circumstance and technology. But Lieutenant Davenport was still dead, and no amount of successful recovery changed that fundamental mathematics. "His family will get a flag," she said quietly. "They'll be told he died serving his country, doing what he loved. They'll have a funeral with honors and strangers in dress uniforms saying words that are supposed to matter. And they'll spend the rest of their lives wondering what those words actually mean when balanced against empty chairs and unfinished conversations." Nash didn't argue because there was no argument. Military service extracted costs paid in currencies that couldn't be calculated in spreadsheets or measured in metals. Sometimes the price was acceptable, proportional to mission and purpose. Sometimes it was just loss, pure and simple, grief dressed in flags and formations. They stood together in silence while the Pacific whispered against the hull far below, its voice ancient and indifferent to human stories played out on its surface. Eventually duty called them back inside, back to schedules and readiness reports, and the endless cycle of preparation for missions that would come whether anyone felt ready or not. Vesper returned to her rack, pulled curtain closed against corridor lights, and lay in darkness that felt different from the darkness over water, but carried the same essential quality of unknown things lurking just beyond perception. Sleep came eventually, thin and populated with dreams of signals that might have been voices, thermal signatures that might have been hope, and water that held secrets it would never willingly release. The memorial service happened 3 days later, after paperwork processed through channels and Lieutenant Davenport's remains received proper preparation for the journey home. The crew assembled in dress uniforms precise and solemn, while chaplains spoke words refined by centuries of necessity, attempting to wrap meaning around absence. The SEALs stood together, 7 men bound by experience that transcended normal teamwork, and when it came time for remembrance, the senior chief stepped forward to speak. His voice carried through the assembled ranks without amplification, train projection meeting acoustics of a space designed for gathering. Danny Davenport was the best officer I ever served under, not because he was perfect, but because he knew none of us were and he led accordingly. He trusted his team, he trained us hard, and he never asked anything he wouldn't do himself. 3 nights ago, he died doing routine operations that we've executed 1,000 times safely. Equipment failed. We brought him to the surface and we kept him with us until help arrived, because that's what he would have done for any of us. The chief's voice cracked slightly, professional composure fracturing around edges before reasserting itself. We don't understand why some people come home and others don't. We don't understand how randomness can kill someone who survived 100 missions more dangerous than the one that took him. But we understand this. Lieutenant Davenport served with honor, led with integrity, and when his time came, he was surrounded by brothers who would have traded places without hesitation. That's the best any of us can hope for. Silence followed, pregnant with shared understanding that outsiders could never fully grasp. Then taps played, mournful and ancient, 24 notes carrying weight beyond their musical simplicity. The flag folded with mechanical precision, triangular and stars forward, presented to representatives who would deliver it to family waiting on distant shores. Dismissed. The days that followed settled into new normal. Vesper returned to flight operations, this time without the asterisk of rehabilitation, without doubt shadowing every mission brief. Her call signs circulated through ready rooms and mess decks, Ghostwater, carrying different connotation now, not just the pilot who'd pulled impossible rescues, but the one who'd proven reliability when it mattered. Lieutenant Nash Garrett remained her regular co-pilot, their crew chemistry refined through repetition and trust that couldn't be manufactured, only earned. Master Sergeant Ortiz maintained their assigned aircraft with pride that bordered on obsession, knowing his meticulous attention to detail mattered when lives depended on rotors continuing to turn and fuel systems delivering without failure. They flew routine patrols, training evolutions, logistics support, the endless tasking that kept carrier operations functional. But everyone knew that when the next impossible situation emerged, when someone needed finding in conditions that suggested they wouldn't be found, Ghostwater would get the call. The SEAL Team 7 survivors returned to full duty within weeks, hypothermia and exhaustion fading faster than psychological scars they wouldn't discuss. They crossed paths occasionally in passageways or mess lines, acknowledgement silent but present, survivors sharing space with the ones who'd brought them back. No dramatic speeches or emotional reunions, just nods and understanding that some debts existed outside normal reciprocity. One evening, the senior chief found Vesper in the wardroom, coffee in hand, reviewing meteorological data with the focused intensity of someone who treated weather forecasting like combat intelligence. "Ma'am, got a minute?" She gestured to an empty chair, setting aside her tablet. "What's on your mind, Chief?" He settled with the particular care of someone whose body still remembered cold water and exhaustion. "Just wanted to say thanks properly without all the brass and formality. What you did out there coming to find us when we were." He paused, searching for words that weren't classified or bound by security concerns. "When things were bad, that mattered." Vesper shook her head slightly. "You would have been picked up eventually. Search patterns were solid, other assets were launching. I just happened to be first on station." "Ma'am, respectfully, that's horseshit." The profanity carried no disrespect, just blunt honesty that bypassed officer-enlisted protocol. "We know how long we were in the water. We know our core temperatures were dropping and our cognitive function was failing. Another hour, maybe 90 minutes, some of us wouldn't have made it. You found us in time that mattered, and the way you flew that aircraft, holding position in conditions that were getting progressively worse, that was skill beyond training." She accepted the words without false modesty. "Your team did the hard part, staying together, maintaining discipline when everything probably told you to panic or give up. That's the real story." "Maybe," he conceded. "But stories need endings, and you gave us one that isn't written on memorial walls." Danny Davenport deserved better than equipment failure and random bad luck. We couldn't give him that, but we could bring him home with dignity, and you made that possible." They sat in silence for a moment, coffee cooling in cups, the wardroom's ambient noise of conversations and ventilation systems providing backdrop to shared understanding. Eventually, the chief stood, nodding once with finality that suggested closure on something neither of them would probably speak of again. "Fair winds, ma'am." And following C's chief, he departed, leaving Vesper alone with weather data and thoughts that spiraled through what-ifs and alternate timelines where signals didn't come through. Thermal signatures remained invisible, and 7 more families received flags instead of phone calls saying "welcome home." But those timelines didn't exist except as haunting possibilities. And in this reality, this actual sequence of events, 7 people breathed and walked and continued their stories because someone heard something that might have been nothing and chose to follow it anyway. Weeks became months, and the Pacific continued its eternal conversation with horizons that never resolved into anything permanent. Vesper flew missions that blurred together in memory, routine patrols and training exercises, logistics runs and VIP transports, the endless variation on themes that comprised naval aviation during periods that weren't quite peace but weren't war either. Her service record reflected reinstatement without caveats, performance evaluations trending positive, trajectory pointing toward command opportunities that had seemed impossible when desk assignments stretched toward indefinite futures. But late at night, when sleep came reluctantly and dreams carried unwelcome clarity, she still saw thermal signatures floating in darkness, still heard partial radio signals that might have been equipment malfunction or might have been human desperation translated through failing electronics. The ocean held secrets beyond the ones they'd recovered, contained multitudes of stories that ended without witnesses, without recovery, without the neat resolution of helicopter extraction and medical treatment. How many signals never got heard? How many thermal signatures faded below detection threshold before search patterns swept their coordinates? How many families waited for answers that would never arrive because luck and timing and the precise intersection of capability and need failed to align? These thoughts weren't productive, didn't contribute to mission readiness or operational effectiveness, but they persisted anyway, unwelcome passengers in consciousness that understood randomness in ways that training manuals couldn't address. Lieutenant Commander Vesper Kane, call sign Ghostwater, decorated veteran of impossible rescues and recipient of second chances, lived with the knowledge that competence and commitment couldn't guarantee outcomes, only increased probabilities that sometimes resolved favorably and sometimes didn't. It was the fundamental equation of military service, written in blood and salt water, and the particular silence that followed rotors spooling down after missions that ended better than they might have. She made peace with it the way generations before her had, by showing up, by maintaining proficiency, by being ready when the call came. One morning 6 months after the SEAL recovery, Admiral Keller summoned her to his office rather than the CIC, a distinction that suggested conversation rather than briefing. His quarters reflected decades of service, walls decorated with unit insignia and photographs, capturing moments when younger versions of himself stood on different decks under different flags, the accumulated evidence of a career spent in service to abstractions like duty and honor, and the specific operational requirements that gave those abstractions practical meaning. "Sit down, Commander." She took the offered chair while Keller poured coffee from a personal pot that probably violated regulations about appliances in officer quarters, but which no one would dare challenge at flag rank. "You've been back on full status for 6 months now. Performance has been exemplary, no incidents, no questionable judgment calls. Your squadron commander speaks highly, and the scuttlebutt on the mess decks is that you're someone people want on station when things go wrong." Vesper accepted the coffee, waiting for the purpose behind summary she already knew. "I'm recommending you for squadron command. It'll take time to process, and there are political considerations beyond my control, but the paperwork is in motion." The words landed with unexpected impact. Squadron command meant responsibility beyond her own aircraft, meant leading pilots and crew, meant decisions affecting careers and missions and outcomes that rippled beyond individual competence. It was validation and burden combined, the Navy saying trust restored while simultaneously increasing stakes. "Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you." Keller smiled slightly, expression carrying weight of experience that new promises meant less than consistent performance. "I'm not worried about disappointment, Kane. I'm worried about the cost of being someone who doesn't disappoint. This job, these responsibilities, they extract prices we don't always see until we've already paid them. Sir, you saved 7 people 6 months ago by following instinct when protocol said search patterns would eventually find them anyway. You were right, and those men are alive because you trusted judgment over procedure. But command means sometimes you'll have to prioritize procedure over judgment, mission objectives over individual rescues, strategic goals over tactical opportunities. It means living with decisions that feel wrong even when they're correct. Vesper considered this, understanding the warning beneath career advice. How do you know which choice to make? You don't, Keller admitted. Not with certainty. You gather information, you consult advisors, you evaluate risks and benefits, and then you make the best decision available with the time and resources you have. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes you never know which you were. But you make the decision anyway because that's what command requires. They sat in silence, contemplating futures built on choices that couldn't be unmade, consequences that accumulated regardless of intention. Eventually Vesper spoke, voice carrying the careful consideration of someone who understood that words, once spoken, acquired weight and permanence. "The night we recovered Team 7, I heard that signal and I chose to follow it. I could just as easily have dismissed it as interference, continued the original search pattern, let other assets handle investigation. If I had, maybe someone else would have found them in time, or maybe not. I'll never know which timeline was more correct. But you made a choice," Keller noted. "You acted rather than deferring to probability, and in that specific instance, your action produced positive outcome." "This time," Vesper agreed. But how many times can you trust instinct before probability catches up, and that same impulse leads somewhere terrible? How do you maintain the edge that makes you effective without crossing into recklessness that makes you dangerous? Keller leaned back, his chair creaking softly, expression thoughtful. "I don't have a clean answer. The best commanders I've known maintained that balance through constant self-examination, through surrounding themselves with people who would call them on their bullshit, through never being so certain of their own judgment that they stopped questioning it. You've already demonstrated you can learn from mistakes. Now you have to demonstrate you can live with success without letting it become armor against necessary doubt." It was perhaps the most honest leadership advice Vesper had ever received, stripped of motivational platitudes and acknowledging that command existed in gray spaces between right and wrong, effective and catastrophic. "I'll do my best, sir." "I know you will. That's why you're getting the recommendation." Dismissed. She stood, saluted, and departed, walking through passageways that suddenly felt different, charged with futures that hadn't existed before conversation shifted trajectories. Squadron command meant responsibility, yes, but also meant opportunity to shape culture, to train the next generation of pilots who would face their own impossible situations and need judgment refined through something more nuanced than procedure manuals. The carrier continued its endless operations around her, aircraft launching and recovering, personnel standing watch rotations, cooks preparing meals, engineers maintaining systems, the vast organic machine of military deployment functioning, because thousands of individuals performed specific tasks with competence born from training and experience. She was one component in that machine, important but not irreplaceable, effective but not invulnerable to the same randomness that had killed Lieutenant Davenport during routine operations. The knowledge was humbling and clarifying. Reminder that significance came from service rather than ego, that legacy built through accumulated competence rather than individual heroics. Vesper returned to Ready Room where pilots and crew gathered between missions, where flight schedules posted on whiteboards and maintenance reports circulated through established channels, where coffee stayed perpetually fresh and gallows humor served as pressure valve against stress. Nash looked up from training materials when she entered, reading her expression with the familiarity of sustained partnership. Keller talked to you about command. Word traveled fast on carriers, especially word that mattered to career trajectories and squadron dynamics. Recommended for Squadron Co. Pending approval, timeline uncertain. Several pilots offered congratulations, genuine and without the competitive edge that might have existed in different circumstances, because competence recognized competence and Ghostwater had proven herself repeatedly. Master Sergeant Ortiz, passing through on maintenance coordination business, paused long enough to nod approval. "About damn time, ma'am. You'll be good at it." The confidence felt unearned even as it felt necessary, external validation providing ballast against internal doubt that whispered about Hormuz and judgment calls that lived in spaces between vindication and disaster. But command required accepting confidence even when uncertain, projecting assurance even when questioning every decision, because people needed leaders who appeared certain, even if certainty was mostly performance. The afternoon brought routine training flight, pattern work in the Marshall stack, approaches and wave-offs and touch-and-goes that built muscle memory for carrier operations that remained fundamentally dangerous regardless of experience level. Vesper flew with the focused precision that had become signature, making each approach textbook perfect not through natural talent, but through relentless attention to detail that refused to accept good enough when excellent was achievable. Landing on a carrier at night in moderate sea states with winds gusting across deck at angles that made stable approach nearly impossible was just physics and skill, and the particular faith that wings and rotors would continue functioning exactly as designed. On the ground it seemed impossible. In the air it was just work, demanding but achievable, the kind of challenge that separated people who could from people who wanted to, and Vesper had spent her career proving membership in the former category. After the fourth approach, the landing signals officer called them down for debrief, standard procedure for training evolution. The LSO's assessment was professional and direct. Approaches were technically sound, glide slope maintenance excellent, lineup consistent, but you're flying angry, Commander. Not reckless, but there's tension in your control inputs that wasn't there last month. Something eating at you. Vesper considered deflecting, offering easy explanations about fatigue or distraction, but the LSO was right and lying served no purpose. Command recommendation came through. Having trouble reconciling what got me here with what the job actually requires. The LSO, a commander himself with 15 years of carrier aviation under his belt, nodded understanding. You're worried that the instincts that made you good at rescue work won't translate to administrative responsibility and strategic thinking. You're worried that command will sand down the edges that made you effective until you're just another bureaucrat pushing paper and attending meetings. Something like that. "Here's what I learned when I took this job," he said, gesturing at the landing signal equipment and the deck that represented his area of responsibility. "Being good at one thing doesn't make you bad at other things. It just means you're learning new skills on top of existing ones. You don't stop being Ghostwater when you become Squadron Co. You just become Ghostwater with more people depending on your judgment." It was simple wisdom, the kind that seemed obvious in retrospect but which required hearing from someone who'd navigated similar transitions. "Thank you, Commander. Don't thank me, just don't crash my airplanes when you get distracted thinking about the future instead of flying in the present." She smiled, tension breaking slightly. "No promises, but I'll try." The next approach came cleaner, input smooth and measured, glide slope perfect, touchdown gentle enough that the landing gear barely compressed. Sometimes all it took was permission to stop fighting yourself, to accept that growth didn't require abandoning whatever made you effective in the first place. That evening, Vesper stood on the flight deck during the quiet period between day and night operations, watching the Pacific surrender definition to darkness, becoming the same featureless void that had held SEAL Team 7 6 months earlier. The ocean was always there, beneath every flight and behind every mission, eternal and patient and ultimately indifferent to human stories played out on its surface. How many operations had ended in these waters over decades of naval aviation? How many pilots and aircrew and passengers had touched these waves for the last time, their final moments witnessed only by salt water and sky that kept no records? The questions weren't morbid, just acknowledgement of context, the statistical reality that flying over water meant accepting risk that occasionally resolved into tragedy despite best efforts and redundant systems. But flying also meant mission accomplishment, meant rescues executed successfully, meant capabilities that transcended ocean's patient hunger for human mistakes. It meant SEAL teams extracted from impossible situations, meant supplies delivered to ships operating beyond land-based support, meant surveillance and deterrence, and the thousand practical applications of military aviation that kept distant wars distant. Legacy wasn't measured in single operations or individual heroics, but in accumulated competence applied consistently over careers that span decades. Vesper understood this now in ways she hadn't before, when youth and ambition had suggested significance came from dramatic moments rather than professional reliability. Ghostwater meant something because she showed up, because she maintained proficiency, because when situations required someone who could find the unfindable and fly the unflyable, she delivered without drama or excuse. That consistency, that boring reliability in extreme circumstances, was the actual measure of professional excellence. The carrier deck around her thrummed with controlled activity, personnel moving with purpose, aircraft staged for missions that would launch when darkness became complete and thermal signatures mattered more than visual acquisition. Somewhere on distant shore, Lieutenant Davenport's family navigated grief that would never fully heal, creating new normal around absence that felt permanent and temporary simultaneously. His teammates continued serving, carrying memories of cold water and impossible choices, maintaining the standard that said no one gets left behind even when retrieval defied logic. Admiral Keller sat in his quarters contemplating decisions about command recommendations and career trajectories, balancing institutional needs against individual capabilities. Nash reviewed flight procedures and emergency protocols, maintaining the quiet competence that made him excellent co-pilot and trusted partner. Ortiz performed maintenance checks on the Seahawk that would fly tomorrow's missions, his meticulous attention ensuring systems functioned exactly as designed when failure meant death. The senior chief from SEAL Team 7 planned training evolution for new operators, passing forward lessons learned in salt water about teamwork and endurance, and the particular faith that said help would come if you could just last long enough. Each person playing their role in the vast machinery of military operations, significant in aggregate even if individually replaceable, their combined efforts creating capabilities that exceeded individual contribution. Vesper was part of that machinery, one component among thousands, an understanding that didn't diminish her importance but rather clarified it, showing how personal excellence served purposes larger than ego or recognition. Command would bring new challenges, different responsibilities, but the fundamental requirement remained unchanged. Show up, maintain proficiency, deliver when called. Everything else was just detail. Stars emerged overhead as twilight surrendered to night, familiar constellations marking positions that would guide navigation if electronic systems failed. Ancient redundancy maintained because some knowledge was too important to trust exclusively to technology. The Pacific whispered against the hull far below, its voice carrying the same message it had always carried. Respect me, prepare well, understand that I will kill you without malice if you make mistakes, but I will also bear you safely if you approach with competence and proper caution. The ocean went silent for hours that night 6 months ago, withholding secrets until circumstances aligned to permit revelation. Then it gave back what it had held, 7 lives and 1 death, outcomes determined by milliseconds and decisions, and the particular intersection of capability and need that sometimes resolved favorably. Vesper stood on deck under stars that had witnessed countless similar stories, understanding that she was both unique individual and latest iteration of archetype that stretched back through generations of people who flew over water and sometimes paid ultimate price for that choice. Her story wasn't finished, would continue through command and beyond, accumulating more operations and decisions and moments where judgment mattered more than procedure. Some of those moments would end well, some would end badly. Most would fall somewhere between ambiguous outcomes that defied clear assessment, but she would face them with competence earned through training and experience, with humility learned from mistakes and near misses, with understanding that excellence was journey rather than destination, maintained through constant attention rather than achieved through singular effort. The carrier would continue its endless operations, regardless of individual drama. The ocean would continue its patient existence, indifferent to human stories, and Ghostwater would continue flying because that's what pilots did, that's what the job required, that's what made the difference between theoretical capability and actual rescue when someone needed finding in darkness that concealed everything except faith that help would come. In the distance, navigation lights marked another aircraft on approach, perfectly aligned with glide slope, descending toward the deck with precision that made impossible landing seem routine. The LSO's radio chatter guided them home with calm authority, technology and training and human skill, combining to defeat gravity and wind, and the fundamental hostility of landing aircraft on moving ships in darkness. The wheels touched, the tail hook caught, and another mission concluded successfully, anticlimactic in its competence, remarkable only in how unremarkable it appeared when executed correctly. That was the real legacy, Vesper understood. Not the dramatic rescues or impossible situations, but the endless accumulation of successful operations that allowed others to take military aviation's capabilities for granted.